One of the points of having this particular workshop or this particular national school this year is we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Communist International. This particular workshop, what we want to do is specifically focus in on the trade union question and what the communist role is in the trade unions. Now, the reason that we're looking at this, right, we're looking at this subdivision of our work and trying to concentrate on what our role is, but what we're not trying to say is that communists should only be involved in trade unions, or that trade unions is the only important work of the Communist Party. We're not saying that. But what we're trying to do is look at one of the important places the communists need to be active. Because as we know, the working class, in defense of its elemental rights against the boss, the first organizations it started were trade unions, right? It was the idea that one worker against the boss has no power. But all the workers together at a particular workplace, at a particular factory, would have a lot of power. They could stop production. They could force the boss into giving in to some of their demands. So it's with that in mind that we're looking at this topic. Now, in terms of preparing for this topic, I wanted to first give the understanding and the overview that what the purpose was of the Comintern resolutions on trade union work. The Comintern, the Communist International, wanted to train the young communist parties to have a correct understanding of the trade unions and of communist intervention into trade union work. And the whole point of this was to go into the trade unions, win over the advanced sections of the working class in a period of revolution, and to do this and with the understanding of what they're facing after the collapse of the Second International, because this was an important thing. Prior to 1914, prior to World War I, you had this huge mass Socialist International, which had been founded originally by Frederick Engels himself. And linked to that international were very large trade unions, particularly in Germany, Britain, Belgium, France, etc., right? And all of these trade unions, when the Second International collapsed and betrayed the working class, the trade unions did as well. And it was within that context that the Communist International was trying to train the young communist parties how to intervene in these unions, some of which were looked at as betrayers of the working class. So first, just a bit of an overview for the Comintern, which a little bit Fred went over this morning. But the Comintern came into existence. It was founded in 1919 with the first Congress in March, right? The USSR the Soviet Union was already in existence. The Russian Revolution had been established with October 1917, but it was fighting for its life in 1919 and 1920. The area basically around Moscow and Petrograd, that was the area that was under the control of the Bolsheviks. The rest of the Russia they had to fight for in the Civil War. But it was during that period they held the first Congress in March 1919. The second Congress was held July 19th to August 7th in 1920. The third Congress of the Comintern was held on June 22nd to July 12th of 1921. And it was while the third Congress was going that they had set up another organization. This organization was going to be independent but linked to the Comintern, and that was going to be called the Red International of Labor Unions. The Red International of Labor Unions, if you use the Russian terminology, which I do not know, maybe we could have Antonio later tell us about that, but it comes out, an acronym comes out as Profintern. So when I refer to the Profintern, I'm talking about the Red International of Trade Unions. But their first Congress, the Profintern's first Congress, starts before the end of the third Congress of the Comintern, also meeting in Moscow. And then there was the fourth Congress of the Comintern, which met from November 30th to December 5th of 1922. We should understand, of course, by the time the third and fourth Congresses come around, the Civil War has been won, the counter-revolution has been beaten, and there is a little bit more stability at that time when they hold the meetings, so more people could attend those meetings. Now, the first Congress of the Communist International didn't really address trade unions that much, but after the first Congress of the Third International, they did send out an open letter to the IWW in the United States, because they recognized, the Comintern recognized that the IWW in the United States collected some of the most militant and some of the most advanced workers in the United States, people who were active in the trade union movement. But although they were militant, although they were revolutionary, although in some ways they were advanced, they had also a lot of ultra-left ideas, a lot of sectarian ideas, which we'll get to a little bit later. So in that open letter that the Comintern was putting out an olive branch and trying to invite them in, that at the same time they were trying to clarify some political views. You know, as I think Sam was pointing out this morning, the IWW had a lot of anarchist views involved. This idea of political abstentionism, not recognizing the bourgeois state. This is one of the flaws of anarchism, right? They don't understand the bourgeois state is there and it has to be dealt with. You know, so in that open letter they tried to address that. And, but it was mainly more in the second, the third, and the fourth Congress of the Comintern that you start having the resolutions on the trade union work and start talking about the meat of what the communists needed to do. Now, the first thing the Comintern wanted to do was to establish political clarity in its own ranks about what the role was of the trade unions in the upcoming revolutionary period. And the first thing the Communist International wanted to explain, and this was an important ideal in terms of clarifying vis-a-vis the anarcho-syndicalist elements that were around them, is that trade unions alone were not going to lead the working class to victory. Right? You needed to have a revolutionary party. You needed to have a communist party, a communist international, which would lead the working class to victory. So we don't accept the idea that trade unions alone can lead the working class to power. So they started on that first principle. But then, after having that principle, they wanted to make sure that they educate the communist rank and file and the communist leadership to the following points of the role that the trade unions or the role the communists can play in the trade unions. First of all, the unions have a role to play in the communist winning of the working class, winning the working class over to communist ideas. Trade unions have a role. That's number one. Number two, in the battle for power, in the battle for the revolution, trade unions also have a role. The communists must work in for that reason. And the third thing is that that even after the Socialist Revolution, after a worker state is established, trade unions also have a role to play in helping the working class train to manage the worker state, to manage industry, and to help the transformation into socialism. So that was the guideline that the Communist International was trying to educate its ranks on, and they basically also wanted to establish a clear Marxist perspective in the trade unions versus these ulterior schools or other schools that existed at the trade unions at that time. I'm going to go through what those schools were. One is called business unionism. Next one is called reformism. And next one is called anarchosyndicalism. So we'll get through all of them. First of all, with business unionism, which was, of course, powerful in the United States, but not only in the United States. You also had, for example, in many countries, you had Christian trade unions, like in Germany and Austria and things like in other countries. Belgium, I think, had some Christian trade unions. They also tended to have this idea of business trade unionism. Business trade unionism was trade unions that usually concentrated on organizing skilled workers based on their particular field of work. Like, for example, organizing electricians, all electricians into one union, organizing all the plumbers into a union, all the cigar makers into another union. You know, that kind of basically organizing on the basis of your trade, of your particular occupation, that kind of idea. And those unions tended to have a parochial attitude. They didn't look at the broader working class. They didn't look at the broader issues facing all workers, but tended to look at just the serving and defending the interests of its particular wing of the working class. And they generally had a class collaborationist perspective. And what we mean by class collaboration, they actually thought what is good for the employer will ultimately be good for the worker. And that what we're trying to do is not to try to fight the boss and force him to do something, but we're trying to come to agreement with the boss so we can both have a win-win situation, you know? By the way, I know this happens, of course, much later, but I remember there was a leader of the United Auto Workers Union in the 1980s. I don't know if comrades remember. Owen Bieber was the head of the UAW. And I remember one time in the late 70s, the UAW started to take a whole series of concessions in their contracts. And they asked him about it. And he says, you know what? I don't know how to negotiate with an employer that doesn't make money. Basically, he's saying, if the employer is doing well, making a profit, I can negotiate. I can get higher wages and benefits for my workers. But if they're not making money, I don't know what to do other than to give up what we've earned, you know? So that's the kind of ideas of business trade unionism. What's good for the worker will ultimately be good for the employer. What's good for the employer is good for the worker. That kind of thing. Thank you. Then you also had the school of the reformist trade unions, right? The reformist trade unions were the big trade unions in Germany that were attached to the SPD, the unions that were attached to the Belgian Labour Party in Belgium, the Labour Party in Britain, those unions, right? Now, the reformist trade unions would, in name, you know, especially on May Day or certain workers' holidays, they would say, we fight for socialism. Our union stands for socialism. But on a day-to-day basis, they weren't about fighting for socialism. They were fighting for reforms. They were fighting for a little wage increase today, a little bit better working conditions tomorrow, a little bit better benefits for the workers in addition to their wages. They were basically fighting for practical demands. And this is the crucial mistake of reformism. They detached the fight for reforms, they detached the fight for a better life today from the struggle for socialism. And you saw this, I don't have the time to go through this, but we could discuss the whole process of the degeneration of the reformist unions in Germany prior to World War I. You know, there comes a point that the unions, the reformist unions in Germany were actually set up by the SPD. They were organized by the SPD when the SPD considered itself a Marxist party, right? And you see, as it gets closer and closer to World War I, this enormous capitalist boom that existed from the late 1800s up till 1914 created conditions where the leadership of the trade unions got complacent. And they basically wanted to separate the unions from the political party, if not nominally, at least in practice. And it's through that they started to detach the demands for the demands for reforms and better life today with the demands for a socialist transformation of society. So the reformist trade unions, of course, those were some of the biggest trade unions in the world. That was another arena that the Marxists would have to fight. And I should also just mention, if you look through the material of the Comintern, and you start seeing them refer to the Amsterdam International. The Amsterdam International is the headquarters of the reformist unions at this time, just so you know what we're talking about. And then, of course, there was the final layer of unions, the anarcho-syndicalist unions, right? Now, the anarcho-syndicalists in the United States and Canada and Australia, it was the IWW, but you also had anarcho-syndicalist attitudes by the shop stewards movement in Britain to some degree, and you also had at that time a union in France called the CGT. The CGT, let's not be confused, later on that union does become led by the Communist Party, right? And today in France, it's led by people who were formerly members of the Communist Party. And yes, in the post-World War II period, it's all a communist-led union. But back in this time, prior to World War I, and back at this time, the CGT had been more or less a union that would be characterized as anarcho-syndicalist. Now, the thing with anarcho-syndicalist unions was this. In general, they were revolutionary. They were not class collaborationists. They did want to fight the boss to the end. They also believed in the transformation of society. But because they were anarcho-syndicalists, because of the anarchism part of that philosophy, they first of all did not understand that the bourgeois state, if you want the workers to take power, the bourgeois state must be taken care of. You must overthrow the bourgeois state. You must smash the bourgeois state. And it must be replaced by a worker state. This is the fatal flaw of anarchism, right? They never recognize that. It's almost, they have this conception that one day the workers will have a general strike and then just like magically the workers will take power. And somehow you don't have to deal with that political entity as if it was just going to disappear into the disappear into the landscape. That never happens. History shows that unless you dismantle that bourgeois state, unless you take it apart, they will come back, the capitalists will come back with a ferocious counter-revolution and drown the revolution in blood. But of course, because of their lack of class collaborationism, the Bolsheviks, the Comintern, understood that among all the unions out there, these are the unions that we have to really try to link up with and try to win over and develop them and work with them so that we can win them over to the ideas of Marxism. So these three schools, business unionism, reformism, anarcho-syndicalism, had to be attacked. And what's going to attack that is the philosophy of Marxism. Now, what's the Marxist approach on the trade unions? Now, I would ask comrades, probably a lot of comrades here have read the book, What Is to Be Done? And in What Is to Be Done, Lenin kind of lays out the difference between what the Marxists need to do in terms of building a revolutionary party and what Marxists need to do in terms of the trade unions. And what's the difference between a revolutionary party and a trade union, which is a very important thing to understand. Lenin says that the party is the most advanced, the most politically conscious wing of the working class, organized together on the basis of Marxist theory, on the basis of Marxist method, on the basis of a Marxist program. That's what the role of the party is. That party must be there to seek to lead, to win over and lead the working class to victory. But the trade unions is a different organization. Unlike the party, which is based around a particular philosophy and method, the trade unions should seek to organize all of the workers together, regardless of what their political ideas are, regardless of whether they have religious ideas, regardless of their philosophy. The trade union should be as broad as possible, should unite all of the workers, if possible, at a particular workplace or in a particular industry. And whereas a party, a political party, a Marxist party, may, under political conditions, have to go underground, the unions should be as public as possible. That's their strength. Basically the trade unions are conceived of as a mass organization to try to encompass as many of the masses as possible, as many of the workers as possible, whereas the party is more restricted in terms of its membership. It's welding together the most advanced elements of the working class based on a specific method, a specific philosophy, and a specific program. Having said that, once you understand the difference between the party and the trade unions, what is the relationship? The relationship is that the party must be active in the trade unions. That's how it's going to gain influence in the working class. That's how it's going to win over the leadership of the working class. It has to be involved in those trade unions and put forward its ideas in a way that workers can understand at that particular time. So what the Comintern comes out with a whole series of resolutions. Some are quite interesting. They talk about the resolutions of how the Communist Party should organize themselves as parties, how they should perform work, and that includes how they should do trade union work. And one of the things that the Comintern says is that the communists should form cells in the workplaces, factories, or trade unions. And that if you have groups of these cells, you would call them a fraction. And that would be a fraction of the party intervening in that particular trade union, that particular industry, or that particular workplace. And they warn, and Fred mentioned this morning, they warned that the whole idea of having cells and fractions, but working into those broader trade unions, means that you should be working in those broader trade unions. You should be working in the unions that have business unionism, reformism, and anarchosyndicalism. They warned against setting up these immaculate, pure trade unions, which are made up of only communists. They said that's not what a trade union is, right? A communist cell in a trade union would be just the communists, members of the party who are in that particular union. Yes, but you don't set up an entire union made up of just communists. And they really wanted to make sure that that was understood. I will point out, though, the whole idea of a cell, just to make sure we understand that. A cell is a fancy word, basically saying a branch. It's a branch of the organization, right? But when they're implying or when they're advocating the idea that you would set up a cell of communists in a particular workplace, or a cell of communists in a particular factory, or a cell of communists in a particular union or a particular industry, that of course means they were sizable organizations compared to us, right? We discussed that a bit this morning. In some cases, the Communist Party was a mass party in France. It was a mass party in Italy. It was a mass party in Germany when they united with the independent Social Democrats. It was a mass party in Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, right? In those countries, it was a mass party. But even in the United States, and the comrades should understand this, at this time in the early 1920s, the Communist Party in the United States was a small party, wasn't a mass party. However, it was way bigger than the IMT is right now in the United States. We're talking about in the early 20s, the United States the American Communist Party had something like 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 members. And that's 10,000 members in a country that was about a third of the size. We had about a third of the population that we had today. It was about 100 million people, right? So we had many more people to work with. If you had that many members and that's percentage of the population, chances are you could have 2 or 3 communists in a factory, or you could have 10 communists in this particular union, or you could have 25 communists in this particular industry. So you had the ability to set up those cells. Someday in the future, comrades, we will be doing that. We will get 5 comrades in the Philadelphia Teachers Union and have a teachers union cell there, or 5 comrades in the New York City Teachers Union and have a cell there, or have 10 comrades in 1199 in New York and we'll have a cell there. And of course, if you have a number of these cells in a particular union, you could put it together as a fraction to put forward the ideas of the party. But given that they had more people, they had more resources, right? They had the beacon of the October Revolution behind them, which attracted all the advanced elements, right? All the vanguard. Remember in 1920, when Lenin wrote Left-Wing Communism, he said, we've won the vanguard. Well, the IMT right now, we haven't won the vanguard yet. We're still too small. We're going to win the vanguard, but we haven't won that. But in 1920, Lenin said, we'd won the vanguard, right? And with that vanguard, with the beacon of the Soviet Union behind them, they were able to expand this work. And another thing they wanted to do was to find ways to unite and to work with anarcho-syndicalists and other left-wing workers who were opposed to class collaboration. And they knew they didn't want to give people an ultimatum. They didn't want to say, join the Communist Party or I have nothing to do with you. That is not the way to win people over, comrades. That's not we understand that, right? This is why we fight against ultra-left sectarian methods in the movement. We understand the way to work, to win people over is you got to try to work with them on at least on common things that we agree with. And then over time, we can win their confidence, we can win their respect, and we can show in practice our ideas versus reality that they should join our party, they should join our movement. So one of the ideas of the Comintern was to set up this Red International of labor unions, which, like I said, was called the Profintern. Now, the idea of the Red International of trade unions was to unite communists, syndicalists, and others on the left opposed to class collaboration in the trade unions. You would be bringing the syndicalists and other militant workers closer to the communists without joining the Communist Party. Collaboration over time would lead to joining the party. It was also another reason they wanted to set up the Red International of Trade Unions, is to have a banner worldwide, again, another beacon, a goalpost, a program for radical trade unionism. And of course, it was going to put forward a program that was basically a communist program, but it wasn't going to be as explicitly communist as the Communist International's program. And the head of the as I mentioned before, the Profintern's first Congress was held at around the same time as the third Congress of the Communist International. And the leader of the Profintern was a comrade named Solomon Lazovsky. Right? And I may mispronounce his name. I think I got it right this time, but someone can correct me later. But Lazovsky, in his leadoff at the fourth Congress of the Communist International, he was explaining the role of the RILU, or the Profintern. He said, the RILU is a unification of revolutionary trade union movement in all its many forms, in all its diversity. Communists belong here, as do syndicalists of every tendency, and all left revolutionary workers. All those who want not class peace, but proletarian struggle against capitalism and its agents. That is why liquidating the RILU would substantially narrow the basis of international communist action, which would logically lead to the liquidation of communist organizations. So remember, again, the conception here, build the party. You want to build a party. You want to have a strong party. You want to have a growing party. But you don't want to just have a party. You want to have links with other workers who might be moving in the direction of the party, but have to be won over time in practical work and practical experience. Now, the relationship of the Communist International and the Profintern was as follows. I'm just going to read this quote. This is from the Communist International. However, in the present transitional period, given the diversity and heterogeneity of the unions as they presently exist, it is vitally necessary to form an independent international association of red trade unions, which accepts the platform of the Communist International in general terms, but admits members with more flexibility than is the case in the Communist International. The Third Congress of the Communist International pledges its support to the Red International of Labor Unions being organized on this basis. In the interest of a closer relationship between the Communist International and the Red International of Labor Unions, the Third Congress proposes that the Communist International be represented by 3 members in the executive of the Red International of Labor Unions, and vice versa, that the Red International elects 3 representatives to go to the Comintern. And just to give you a sense of what the first Profintern or Red International Labor, what their first Congress was like, on July 3rd, 1921, the first Congress of the Profintern gathered 342 trade union delegates from 42 countries, and this is interesting, representing 17 million workers. After electing its representatives to the Presidium, the Congress will consider, this is the first Congress of the Profintern, will consider the report of the Provisional International Council and then proceed with the principal tasks of the Congress to discuss the work which falls under the following headings. Number 1, world economic crisis. In other words, what were they discussing? World perspectives, basically, right? World perspectives. The relations between the Trade Union International and the Communist International. That was the second point of business. The third point, problems of organization and tactics. That's actually where they go through country by country and see how to build the Profintern in those countries, build support for the ideas. Fourth, the constitution of the RTU, the Red International Trade Unions. Number 5, workers' control of industry. Number 6, unemployment. Number 7, the shop stewards and workers committees. And number 8, manifestos. This is where they're going to deal with all the nitty-gritty of the action program, which I'm going to go into. So you could see, comrades, there was exciting possibilities that here you have the building of the Communist International, the building of the Communist Party, and then also the building of the Red International Trade Unions, which would bring larger sections of the working class behind the communist movement at that time. Now, one thing we should understand is that when they're building this, there are rapid changes in the objective conditions, particularly affecting the trade union movement at the time. After the end of World War I, as we know, there was a huge wave of revolutions, right? Finland, Russia, Austria, Hungary, Germany, etc., right? You have a whole series of revolutions going on throughout the world. At the same time you had these revolutions, you actually had growth of the trade unions. In the United States at the end of World War I, you had a growth in the American Federation of Labor. You had a growth in the trade unions, right? In Germany, you had a growth in the trade unions. The wind there. You had a growth of the trade unions in Germany. You had a growth of the trade unions membership in Britain. You had a growth of the trade unions in France. So you saw a whole series of growth in the trade union movement right at the end of World War I. By 1921, 1920-21, capitalism starts to stabilize, right? A lot of these revolutions were defeated. We start going into what in the United States was called the Roaring Twenties, right? And then what happens? The unions start to decline again, even in the United States. After that blip, they grow a little bit, 1919, 1920, and then they start to decline. And this starts happening in all of these countries. So this had to be looked at. That's one of the reasons they discuss perspectives. You have to see what's going on in the trade union movement. Are we growing? Are we stalling? Are we declining? What's going on? And so as the movement started to decline, as the capitalist boom started and the capitalists went back on the offensive against the trade union movement, this was something the communists wanted to discuss in the trade union movement. How can we turn unions into unions that will fight and beat the boss? Because workers would join these unions and they would expect a better life. But when the capitalists went on the attack, they found a trade union leadership that even in those days was not willing to mobilize the membership to fight. Even in those days, it was always going to respect bourgeois law, which of course was written so that the bourgeois would win those struggles. The communists wanted to address that. And as a result, they wanted to make sure that the communists that were working in the cells in the unions and in the trade union fractions, that they had some sort of program, that they could go to the workers with that program and win them over to the ideas of Marxism. Now, if you read the action program, by the way, you see, like, for example, later in the 1930s, when Trotsky writes the transitional program, you can see Trotsky didn't just make up this program from thin air. He didn't just say, like, oh, this will be a nice demand. He's taking this from a lot of the literature that was constructed in the Third International, in these early Congresses, and in the Comintern. He's taking that and adding that as part of his transition program. So first of all, it tackles this question, and Fred got into this a little bit, about the question of trade union neutrality, right? Now, when the union leaders, a lot of times the reformist union leaders, definitely the business unionist trade union leaders, but even sometimes in a weird way, the anarchosyndicalists had this idea that the union should be neutral or should be apolitical, right? And communists should fight those ideas. Well, we fight the so-called neutrality of unions with a class understanding of politics, with a class understanding of the state. We understand, for example, unions are not neutral. Whether you consider yourself neutral or not, they're not really neutral. You're involved in a class struggle. The political parties that exist are not neutral. They're controlled by a class, and usually it's controlled by the bourgeois class, right? The only party at that time that would really represent the workers was the Communist Party. So all these other parties were basically agents of the ruling class or agents of the petty bourgeois, right? And that the state apparatus exists, and that has to be taken up as an apparatus that must be defeated if the workers are going to seize power. And it's not a neutral entity either, like the reformists think, that you could elect a few congressmen or you could elect a socialist to the president, and then the state institution becomes a tool for the working class. No, it's not. It's a state institution constructed by the bourgeoisie, used by the bourgeoisie to maintain their power. So they took that up as the beginning of their action program. And they also talked about what else the trade unions needed to do in order to fight and win, in order to push back the offensive of the bosses. One of the things they argue is for the idea of industrial unions. Industrial union means this. It means all of the workers at a particular workplace, all of the workers who work in that factory, whether they work on the electricity or the plumbing of the building, whether they're sweeping the floor, or whether they work on the assembly line, whatever they do, all of the workers from the top to the bottom should be organized in one union. That's the idea of industrial unionism, right? We see in many ways, this is actually an issue that should have been a historical issue. It should have been dealt with by now by history. In actual fact, comrades, in our struggles, or maybe this will come up in the discussion, in our struggles in the United States today, we actually have to take up, again, the issue of industrial unionism. In many ways, you see that the trade union bureaucracy is going along with the ruling class and breaking up workers at particular workplaces. To give you an example, right, I was talking to a comrade from Minneapolis. She was saying in her school, you have one union for the teachers and one union for the para-teachers, and they don't want the two unions to work together. That's a mistake. And of course, those unions should be working with the janitors, should be working with the cleaners, should be working with the bus drivers, who should be working with the lunch ladies. All of the workers in that particular workplace should be united into one strong union. You also have other situations, like I know where Sam used to work. Sam used to work in a home for elderly people, and in that particular place, that theoretically it was all organized by 1199. However, along with those union members, they would have these people who come in on a daily basis, right? Temps, basically, right? And these temps would work there. And they weren't working there just 1 day or 2 days. They'd actually work there 10 years, and they would never be in the union. That also is breaking up the whole concept of industrial unionism. So the Communist International said, we must fight for industrial unionism. All the workers must be amalgamated into one union. And if you can't do that, at least get all the unions in the workplace to work together as a united front. Linked with that, they have this concept of what they call the factory committees, which today we could call it factory committees, workplace committees, whatever. But it's, again, the same concept, that you have all of the people who work in that workplace. I don't care if they're temps. I don't care if they're full-time. I don't care if they've been there 10 years or they've been there 1 day. All of the workers in that workplace get to elect representatives to the factory committee or the workplace committee. And that committee ends up representing the workers in the struggle against the boss. Now, of course, you're posing the idea of a factory committee or a workplace committee because you want to lead the workers in struggle against the boss, right? So it presupposes struggle, right? So that we understand. But those kind of committees at times of strikes or at times of where there are pitched battles going on, those committees can actually sometimes be more effective or even take the place of some of the trade unions, which because of the policies of the bureaucracy going along with the bourgeois, they're restrictive. They don't necessarily organize all the workers who actually work in the workplace. By the way, just as another example, the United Auto Workers Union started as an industrial union. And if you go back in 1971, if you're in a factory, a General Motors factory, the guy who swept the floor was in the UAW. The guy who was the electrician in the plant was in the UAW, and the guy who worked on the line was in the UAW. But if you go to GM now, it's not like that. They have contracted out the cleaning. They have contracted out this. So you have non-union workers working there who aren't represented. If you're in a strike, you're in a fight back, you want all those workers represented, and factory committees can be part of that solution. So that was part of the action program. The other demands would of course that the Comintern and the Profintern mentioned that if the workers are going to fight and win, they're going to need direct action by the Thank you. They're going to need direct action by the masses. The masses must engage in the following, and they say, by the way, the masses must fight against the bosses and their state. They made sure they include and their state. But these were the kinds of actions they were advocating for mass action: boycotts, strikes, street demonstrations, seizures of factories, and of course, ultimately armed insurrection. Now, I want to just make one comment. When they say boycotts here, they're not talking about consumer boycotts, like we're not going to buy General Motors cars. That's what they mean. They're talking about boycotts. They're talking about like what the Italian workers and the French workers are doing, where they're boycotting ships. They refuse to load ships that are going to Yemen for that war. That's what they mean by boycotts. Actual active boycotts by the working class to stop production, to stop the distribution of things. And they also make the point that as much as possible, while you're building industrial unions, they want the unions to be united. They're against splits, particularly against political splits from the unions, because they know that that's bad. That's only going to serve the right wing. If you take the more advanced workers, split them away from the other workers in a particular union, that's only going to help the right wing maintain its control in that other union that you split from. So they really urged that idea of uniting the labor movement. And in fact, there was a lot of red baiting and a lot of attacks against the communists. They were trying to drive the communists out of different unions at the time, right? And the Comintern and the Profintern said, we are going to fight against being thrown out. We're not going to go out gladly and say, oh yes, we'll form our own red union. No, we're going to fight against that. And we're going to say the union movement needs to be united. And these people, these trade union leaders, are the ones that are weakening the trade union movement by splitting. Now, in addition to that, they mention that, for example, on the question of the struggle for unemployed, right? If people are being unemployed, the workers should join with the unemployed and fight for the bosses to pay their wages. Pay their wages in full. These are issues, again, comrades, that are going to come up. In the past, you know what they do in my union when in New York City? They threaten to lay off people. And they say, but you know what? We won't lay off people if you take concessions, if you give up this, if you give up that, right? We should be saying, no, we're not going to take concessions. In fact, what the union should be doing, the union should fight with the unemployed, and the city should, or the employer should have to pay their wages in full for all the time that they're unemployed. That's the way you organize people to battle and fight back. And linked with that, of course, is a demand: open the books. You say you got to lay off people because you can't afford it. Open the books. Show us where the money is being spent. We want to see that. We'll get workers' accountants to workers' bookkeepers to take a look at that and see where the money is really spent. They also said it's very important that you have workers, and particularly miners, railway workers, electricity, gas workers. Don't let one factory get pitted against another. Don't get one industry pitted against another. This again comes up over and over in the labor movement, right? You have a situation, and the bureaucracy allows this, right? They have different unions, have different contract expirations, so they have strikes that are separate. No, we don't want to do that. We want to have everybody fighting at the same time. We want to have the most leverage that we can. These are the ideas that we're going to put forward against them. Just also, by the way, on the concept of the union contracts, the Comintern wrote the following. They said, The revolutionary movement must strongly criticize the absolute faith in the value of collective agreements preached by opportunists everywhere. The collective agreement is nothing more than an armistice. The owners always violate these agreements at the earliest opportunity. This religious attitude towards collective agreements is evidence that bourgeois ideology is firmly rooted in the minds of the leaders of the working class. Revolutionary trade unions must not reject collective agreements, but they must understand that their value is limited and must be prepared to break the agreements when this benefits the working class. So we don't adhere to unions. If it's an opportune movement, we could get the workers to go on strike. Even if there's a union contract, we would say break the agreement, We don't want to follow bourgeois laws, which are meant to weaken us and destroy us. We don't want to follow bourgeois agreements because of that as well. They also mentioned, by the way, this demand for profit sharing that the reformists put up from time to time, that they said, why should we share profit? All the profit is from the unpaid labor of the working class. We want nationalization under workers' democratic control. That was basically their strategy. Now, I just, one more thing I wanted to mention, because we also have to address this, is how do communists win over the working class from the trade union leaders? How do they expose them? They don't do it by denouncing people. They do it by looking at the concrete struggles that go on and show where the leadership is on the wrong track from where the leadership should be. And I'm going to take this quote verbatim because I want to prove that it's just another proof that we are following the methods of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky regarding on how we expose the trade union leadership, unlike the ultra-left, which just denounces the trade union leaders from the sidelines. But from the Third Congress, this is a resolution on how to do the work in the trade unions and how to win them over from the false leaders of the labor movement. They said, in the struggle against the social democratic and other petty bourgeois leaders of the trade unions and various workers' parties, there is no hope of achieving anything by persuasion. The struggle against them has to be organized with great persistence. It can only be waged successfully by depriving the leaders of their followers and by showing the workers the real role the social trader leaders play at the beck and call of the capitalists. Therefore, when the opportunity arises, these leaders should be put in a position where they have to show their true nature. Then a vigorous attack can be launched against them. It is by no means sufficient just to label the Amsterdam leaders scabs. Practical examples of how they sell out the workers must constantly be found. Their activity in the trade unions, in the International Labor Organization of the League of Nations, in the bourgeois ministries and administrations, their right-wing speeches at conferences and in Parliament, the attitudes expressed in their numerous lulling articles and hundreds of papers, and in particular, the hesitancy and reluctance they show in preparing and conducting even the smallest campaigns for wage increases and improvements in working conditions. All of this provides the communists with daily opportunities to expose in simply formulated proposals and resolutions and in clear speeches the unreliable and right-wing activity of the Amsterdam leaders who do indeed deserve to be called scab leaders. Cells and fractions must conduct a systematic practical struggle. Communists must not be put off by the lower-level trade union bureaucracy, who often have good intentions, but who, not being strong enough to put them into practice, use the statutes and resolutions of the union congresses or the directives of the central administration as excuses not to act. Communists should stick firmly to their chosen course of action and always demand that the lower-level bureaucrats give definite answers to their questions, say what they have done to eliminate the obstacles hindering the struggle, and whether they and the members of their unions are ready to fight openly to remove these obstacles. Now, comrades, I know my time is running out, so I'm just going to quickly wanted to sum up about particularly how the Comintern work and how the communist work was put into place in the United States. Just quickly, because maybe I'll have to come in more on this in the summation, or maybe some comrades can add to this in the discussion, but the American trade union leader named William Z. Foster in 1920, he set up an organization called the Trade Union Educational League. And in the Trade Union Educational League, he had this idea that the left, and he had been in the IWW, and he said, the IWW is wrong. They stay outside the AFL unions. The IWW members should be in the AFL unions. They should be working. They should be fighting for the idea of industrial unionism inside the AFL, right? He even was successful. He actually convinced some of the union leaders in the AFL to set up amalgamated locals, and he was able to successfully organize packing house workers and unsuccessfully tried to organize steel workers in Chicago at that time. But William Z. Foster ends up coming to the Comintern meeting and the Comintern meeting. They win him over to the Communist Party, and when they win him over, the TUEL ends up joining the Communist Party. So what is the TUEL? It was a broad front. It was a way of organizing the Red International of labor unions in the United States. And again, it was a broad front. You didn't have to be a communist to be in the TUEL, but all the communists who were working in the trade unions would also be in the TUEL. Would be working together. And the whole idea is to recruit them to the Communist Party, or at least to get them to work with us under the influence of our ideas. And it was tremendous work that they accomplished. First of all, he had a magazine called Labor Herald. Now, to subscribe to Labor Herald, there was no membership cards, by the way. The reason they didn't want membership cards is they said if you're a member of the TUEL, the trade union bureaucracy might expel you for being a member. So they said, we're not going to have membership, but you can subscribe to our magazine. And the magazine was called Labor Herald, and it cost $2.50 a year to subscribe. Now, if you take that at that time, that would be about $40 a year to subscribe to Labor Herald. And they would get the Labor Herald, and Labor Herald, I looked through some of the old editions. You can also check that out online. And again, they say it's open to communists and all people in the trade union movement who want to fight for industrial unionism. Thanks. And I'm going to end up. They want to fight for industrial unionism. They want to fight for a militant policy, and so on and so forth. And it had many articles, by the way, contemporary articles about stuff going on in Soviet Russia, etc. Now, that started with a very small group, right? Because there were actually very few American communists at that time who were in the AFL. So they started with a small group. Eventually, they're able to build it to a circulation of 15,000 subscribers. Eventually, they're able to have 500 core militants of the TUEL, and they become a major force in some unions. In the 1920s, the TUEL is able to organize a challenge to John L. Lewis for president of the Mine Workers Union. And they didn't win, but they came pretty close. They did pretty well. So they were able to make a lot of gains and bring in a lot of these people into the Communist Party. The sad thing, of course, is that we know from this morning we discussed, there's the Stalinist degeneration of the Comintern. There's a Stalinist degeneration of the Comintern. They take all of this information and throw it out the window. And by 1928, they've backed to the policy of red trade unions. They have all the communists split. So all this work, everything that was accomplished is thrown away. It's just, dumped on the ground. It's very frustrating when you read the history. You see all this work, all this accomplished, just thrown away, right? And in 1928, they rename it the Trade Union Unity League, which is exactly the opposite of what it was. It was not the Trade Union Unity League. It was red trade unions. It was splitting from the trade. And it weakens the movement, and then the rest is history. But comrades, there's a lot of stuff to look at. There's probably a lot of questions about, if there's some questions, so some of the points that I made, some of the reference, please bring it up. If you have additional information, please bring it in. But I think this is the basis. We have to study some of these lessons as the basis for our future work. Of course, our work right now is just mainly recruiting the ones and twos and just starting up the basics of work in the unions. But I think we have a great future work in the unions coming in the next period. So I'll stop right there. Thanks.